obligations of Malaysia, not New Zealand. Kia ora. Thank you. I call Chris Penk.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, for the chance to speak on the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, CPTPP Amendment Bill. I'll follow the convention of others who have spoken before me and adopt a shorthand version of that. Madam Chair, Madam Speaker, I was part of the Select Committee that considered the bill, as well as the Select Committee that considered a number of submissions in relation to the agreement itself. In the second phase, we considered submissions that were made in relation to the legislation that would ratify the agreement. And so I'd like to focus on some of those contributions. Previous speakers, including the one who's just resumed her seat, have mentioned changes that we did recommend. I'd actually like to focus on some changes that, as a committee, the majority thereof, we did not recommend, but I think nonetheless deserve the credit for being intelligently proposed and made in good faith. I think it is important that we do have a political approach, as the member Michael Wood encourages, notwithstanding that politics as opposed to politicking might be different things. I don't wish to get into that, Madam Speaker, except to say that I do believe in an adversarial system of lawmaking, such that if we thrash out all the ideas in a way that is passionate but nonetheless reasonable, then we have the best possible chance of arriving at the least dangerous laws for our land, Madam Speaker. So I'd actually like to focus, as I say, on a change that was proposed, albeit not recommended, proposed to the Select Committee, albeit not recommended by it. That was by the NGO named It's Our Future. It was supported by the Green Party in its minority report, and I think it's worth setting out the reasoning and indeed the proposed amendment itself. Essentially, it's to limit the expansion of the agreement such that other parties will not be able to, other countries, nation-state parties will not be able to join the agreement except a couple of conditions apply. The first of those would be that New Zealand would negotiate and sign a binding instrument with that new country proposing to be joined, in which such an agreement would an instrument, as opposed to the agreement proper, would waive the right for investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms. The second criterion was in relation to full parliamentary examination, as though the whole treaty and ratification process were to begin anew. I think those have a certain logic that is very reasonable if from a certain constitutional perspective, namely that Parliament should have oversight of all treaty making. That's certainly not the traditional case in a Westminster system, whereby it's the executive that has the power to execute foreign policy, originally derived from the monarch. And so it is that essentially what is being proposed here, while it would be in favour, I suppose, of greater consultation, would actually represent a considerable constitutional change, and one that I think is more appropriate for a broader conversation about the way in which laws are made internally in this country and with respect to international obligations. For example, if the laws that we make locally to ratify other agreements, for example, the Paris Climate Accord, needed to be subject to parliamentary scrutiny every time another state signed up to that or perhaps withdrew from that, then that would be something that I suspect those who are proposing this kind of change now for this agreement, with which they do not agree, would find perhaps unpalatable. So a consistent approach across that constitutional proposal, I think, would actually be very helpful to bear in mind, Madam Speaker. So the rules of the game are known as they currently stand. So actually what Parliament is doing now is considering a bill that will ratify a particular agreement that is known with a particular set of parties that are known, and also other parties that may wish to join on the terms currently agreed in that agreement. On that basis, my party is very happy to maintain our original position in favour of a an agreement that we think will do very good things for our country and other countries too, incidentally, in respect of boosting trade, and do that in a responsible and safe way. Other parties have apparently changed their position on that somewhat, but I do note the principled consistency of the Greens, at least in that regard, to recognise that the things that they found objectionable before, they still find objectionable now. So I'll bring my contribution to a close now, Madam Speaker, with that final plea just to encourage those who would suggest changes to the way that we make our laws in this country, that if it is good enough for this particular agreement with which they are not enamoured, that should be the case for others as well, and that would be a broader debate that is something of a constitutional geek I would welcome very much indeed.
Well done, Chris.
I call Penk a Radhakrishnan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.